It was a cold January morning in 1944 when Major General James "Jimmy" Doolittle walked into the headquarters of the U.S. 8th Air Force in England. On the wall above the desk of Major General William Kepner hung a sign that summed up the philosophy of the air war so far. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle studied the words carefully. For 2 years, American fighter pilots had been trained to act as guardians, flying tight defensive circles around bomber formations as they thundered across Europe. But the results were grim. Bomber losses were climbing to unsustainable levels, and every mission deep into German territory cost hundreds of lives. Turning to Kepner, Doolittle made a quiet but decisive statement that would reshape the air war over Europe. "That sign is wrong. Take it down." In its place, a new sign appeared within hours. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." This single sentence marked a revolution in military thinking. Until then, air combat doctrine had treated fighters as shields rather than swords. Doolittle, an engineer, test pilot, and strategist, understood that wars in the air were not won by defense. They were won by seizing the initiative, by hunting the enemy, not waiting to be attacked. The change shocked many within the Air Force. Bomber crews feared that their flying escorts would abandon them, leaving them exposed to German interceptors. Even some commanders thought Doolittle's idea reckless. Yet Doolittle had seen enough combat to know the truth. Every time Allied fighters stayed close to protect the bombers, German pilots could dictate the battle. They attacked in waves, inflicted terrible losses, and slipped away untouched. If the air war was to be won, that pattern had to end. The fighters needed freedom. Freedom to move, to chase, to strike first. Doolittle's new directive was more than a tactical adjustment. It was a declaration of intent. From this moment on, the goal was no longer to survive. It was to destroy the enemy's air force completely. The decision would soon prove to be one of the most consequential in modern warfare. Within weeks, skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe would be filled with American fighters, sweeping far ahead of the bombers, changing the balance of power in the air. What began as a quiet exchange in a cold office on January 6, 1944, would ignite a campaign that crushed German air resistance and paved the way for victory in Europe. Before Jimmy Doolittle took command, the air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. The U.S. 8th Air Force, tasked with daylight bombing of German industry, was suffering losses so severe that many doubted the campaign could continue. Each mission into Germany was a test of endurance and courage, and for many, a one-way flight. The numbers told the story. In October 1943, during the raid on Schweinfurt, a city vital to Germany's production of ball bearings, 2091 American B-17 bombers set out across enemy territory. They reached their target and dropped their bombs with precision, but the cost was unbearable. 60 bombers never returned. Another 17 were too damaged to fly again. In one afternoon, more than 600 airmen were dead or missing. Bomber crews began to realize the truth. Few wanted to say aloud. Completing the required 25 missions was statistically impossible. Survival rates during the harshest months of 1943 fell below 40%. Young men climbed into their flying fortresses each morning, knowing they were unlikely to live long enough to finish their tour. The cause of these losses was no mystery. American escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, could not travel deep enough into Germany to protect the bombers all the way to their targets. As they reached the edge of their fuel range, they had to turn back. Beyond that invisible line, the bombers flew alone into hostile skies. There, German fighters waited in ambush. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 90s, had developed brutal tactics. They formed up out of sight, beyond Allied radar and visual range. then attacked in head-on formations at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. A single burst from their 30mm cannons could tear a B-17 apart. Bomber crews described these attacks as flying through a storm of fire. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, wrote in his diary after one mission, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the border, and we go on alone into hell." The Luftwaffe was confident it was winning the war of attrition. Despite Allied bombing, German aircraft production was increasing, and their veteran pilots were inflicting devastating losses. Meanwhile, the American strategy, to rely on the bombers' defensive machine guns and tight formations, was proving tragically insufficient. By late 1943, General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, faced a grim choice. Either the German fighter force was destroyed, or the entire bombing campaign, and with it, the planned invasion of Europe, would have to be abandoned. The situation demanded more than new machines. It required new thinking. The Allies needed a strategy that could strike at the heart of the Luftwaffe itself. The answer would come in the form of a new aircraft, and a general willing to defy every rule of air warfare. The turning point in the air war did not begin with a battle, but with the arrival of an aircraft, a sleek silver machine that would soon dominate the skies over Europe. In late 1943, the North American P-51 Mustang entered combat, and with it came a revolution in both range and performance that changed everything for the USA 8th Air Force. Originally designed for the British, the Mustang was transformed when engineers fitted it with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a powerful, supercharged marvel capable of maintaining performance at extreme altitudes. The result was astonishing. The Mustang could fly faster, higher, and farther than any Allied fighter before it. With external drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers over 1,600 miles, deep into the heart of Germany and back to England, something no American fighter had ever achieved. It cruised comfortably above 400 miles per hour and climbed with ease to 40,000 feet, where the thin air crippled most German aircraft engines. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 90s could still fight fiercely, but for the first time, they were facing an opponent that was faster, more agile, and capable of reaching every corner of German airspace. American pilots were quick to recognize the difference. Captain Chuck Yeager, flying with the 357th Fighter Group, described his first combat mission in a P-51. "We could finally stay with the bombers all the way in, and when the Germans showed up, we didn't have to run. We could fight, and we could win." The Mustang gave the Allies the tool they had been missing: range, speed, and endurance combined in one platform. But even this breakthrough would not be enough without a change in how the fighters were used. Under the old doctrine, escort fighters flew tightly around bomber formations, like a shield. Their duty was to stay close, warding off enemy attacks but never straying far. This defensive posture gave the advantage to the Luftwaffe. German pilots could choose when and where to attack, diving through the bombers at full speed and escaping before the escorts could react. Doolittle understood that the Mustang's abilities could only be fully exploited if the old rules were broken. These planes were built to hunt, not to hover. They could reach the enemy before the bombers arrived, strike at the German formations as they assembled, and pursue them relentlessly across the Reich. With the P-51 Mustang, the Americans now possessed a fighter that could challenge the Luftwaffe on equal and soon superior terms. The stage was set for a new kind of air war, one that would shift from defense to attack, from endurance to dominance. The Mustang was not just another aircraft, it was the weapon that would allow Doolittle's radical strategy to come alive, a machine perfectly matched to the new order he was about to impose. On his first full day as commander of the 8th Air Force, January 6, 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle issued an order that stunned both his subordinates and his superiors. The new policy was simple but revolutionary. Fighter escorts were no longer to stay close to the bombers. From now on, American fighters would roam freely, up to 50 miles ahead, and 25 miles to either side of the bomber stream, actively searching for and destroying German fighters. Once the bombers had released their bombs, the fighters would not turn home immediately. Instead, they would drop to low altitude and attack airfields, fuel depots, and transport lines on their return. The goal was not merely to protect bombers, it was to annihilate the Luftwaffe. This radical departure from existing doctrine caused shock and confusion. For years, escort pilots had been drilled to remain in tight formation with the bombers, never straying far. They saw themselves as bodyguards, shields in the sky. To suddenly abandon the bombers seemed reckless, even suicidal. Many bomber crews were furious when they heard of the change. These men had endured months of brutal losses and had come to rely on seeing American fighters circling nearby as a lifeline. To them, the idea that those fighters would fly off over the horizon felt like betrayal. As one crewman put it, "They're leaving us to die." But Doolittle saw further than anyone else. He knew that defense alone could never win air superiority. Staying close to the bombers might reduce losses on a single mission, but it allowed the Luftwaffe to rebuild and strike again. If the Allies wanted lasting safety for their bombers, they needed to destroy the enemy fighters before they could even attack. Not all pilots doubted the new plan. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the famous 4th Fighter Group, immediately understood what it meant. He told his men, "This is what we've been waiting for. We're not shepherds anymore. We're hunters." For the first time, fighter squadrons would have the freedom to fight offensively. Instead of reacting to German attacks, they would seize the initiative, taking the battle directly to the enemy. Doolittle believed that this shift in mindset, from protection to destruction, would change the course of the air war. Still, the risk was immense. If his gamble failed, bomber losses could become unbearable, and his reputation would be ruined. But if it worked, the Luftwaffe would be broken within months, paving the way for the Allied invasion of Europe. The order went out across England that day, and the sign above the operations room was changed. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. It was a bold declaration of intent, a promise of aggression, and a challenge to every pilot who flew beneath the Allied insignia. The coming weeks would prove whether Doolittle's reckless new strategy was genius or madness. The real test of Doolittle's new strategy came only weeks later, in February 1944, during a massive operation that would become known as Big Week. Officially called Operation Argument, it was designed to lure the Luftwaffe into one final, decisive battle for control of the skies over Germany. The plan was as daring as it was dangerous. Instead of avoiding the most heavily defended areas, the U.S. and British Air Forces would strike directly at Germany's aircraft industry. Factories in Regensburg, Leipzig, Brunswick, and Schweinfurt that produced the very fighters threatening Allied bombers. The logic was simple. These targets were so critical that the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to rise and defend them with everything it had. On February 20th, 1944, under clear winter skies, more than 1,000 American bombers lifted off from airfields across England and Italy. Hundreds of newly equipped P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts flew beside them, ready to put Doolittle's order into action. Among the German defenders, the significance of the mission was immediately understood. Major Erich Hartmann, one of Germany's most skilled pilots, reportedly told his men, "This is not a bombing raid. It's a fighter battle with bombers as bait." He was right. As the bombers crossed into German airspace, hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters scrambled to intercept. But this time, the Americans were ready. The Mustangs, now flying freely ahead of the bombers, spotted German formations. As they were still climbing, they attacked first, diving from above with speed and surprise. For years, German pilots had been the hunters. Now they were the hunted. Many never even reached the bombers. Others were caught taking off or forming up and were destroyed before they could join the fight. The air above central Germany turned into a storm of fire and contrails. In a single day, over 900 German fighters engaged more than 1,000 Allied bombers and escorts. It was the largest air battle in history. To that point, the results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. While the Americans lost around 21 bombers and 4 fighters that first day, German losses exceeded 50 fighters destroyed and dozens more damaged. Worse still, nearly 40 of Germany's best pilots were killed or wounded, men whose experience could never be replaced, and Big Week had only just begun. For 5 days, the attacks continued whenever weather allowed. American bombers struck one aircraft factory after another, forcing the Luftwaffe into constant combat. Each day, the German fighter arm grew weaker. By the time Big Week ended on February 25th, the statistics were conclusive. The Americans had lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters, serious but sustainable losses, given their immense production and training capacity. The Luftwaffe, however, had lost over 350 fighters and nearly 100 irreplaceable pilots. The impact went far beyond numbers. German squadrons returned to their bases, shattered and demoralized. Their airfields, now regular targets of strafing attacks, were unsafe even on the ground. Mechanics were killed, servicing planes, fuel and ammunition were destroyed in their depots. Big Week marked the moment the balance of power in the air shifted decisively to the Allies. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe could no longer replace its losses. Doolittle's gamble had paid off. His new tactics had not only protected the bombers more effectively than the old defensive method ever could, they had broken the back of the German Air Force. From this point onward, the skies over Europe would belong to the Allies. The Luftwaffe would fight on bravely, but never again as an equal. After Big Week, the skies over Europe began to change. For the first time since the war began, German airfields that had once swarmed with confident pilots now stood half empty. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding to death, and Doolittle's new tactics were the cause. Between February and May 1944, the destruction accelerated. Each bombing raid, each fighter sweep, chipped away not only at German aircraft, but at something even more valuable: its trained pilots. By the spring, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,000 fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing. These were not raw recruits. They were the veterans, the men who had carried the air war since 1939. Germany could still build planes, but it could no longer build pilots fast enough. Training programs were cut to the bone. By mid-1944, new fighter pilots received barely 100 hours of flight training, compared to over 450 hours for their American counterparts. Many were rushed into combat without mastering formation, flying, or gunnery. Some did not even know how to use their radios properly. Veteran German aces described the desperate situation in their letters and diaries. Major Heinz Baer, with more than 200 victories, wrote bitterly, "We shoot down a few bombers, but the fighters are everywhere, above, below, behind. We take off and they are waiting for us. We land and they strafe our airfields. There is no escape." This constant, relentless pressure was part of Doolittle's plan. His pilots were ordered not only to intercept enemy fighters in the air, but also to attack them on the ground. Every day, American squadrons returning from escort missions dropped to low altitude to strafe German airfields, destroying parked aircraft, fuel depots, and maintenance crews. The result was devastating. The German pilots, who survived a dogfight, often returned home to find their airfields in flames, their comrades dead, and their planes destroyed before they could even refuel. The Luftwaffe could no longer rest, rebuild, or reorganize. By March 1944, this strategy reached its peak during the first major Allied raid on Berlin. Over 700 bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, struck the German capital. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense, more than 150 fighters, but they were torn apart. The Americans lost 69 bombers that day, but the Germans lost over 160 aircraft and 70 experienced pilots in a single afternoon. One surviving German officer wrote afterward, "Today I watched the German fighter arm die. We fought with all our strength, and it was not enough. Their numbers, their speed, their skill, none of it could be stopped. The war is lost." By April 1944, the transformation was undeniable. German fighter units were operating at less than 60% of their former strength. Many squadrons existed only on paper. Those that did fly were filled with inexperienced young men, often teenagers, facing seasoned Allied pilots and superior machines. The Luftwaffe's decline was not due to a single defeat, but to systematic exhaustion. Doolittle's strategy, hunt first, strike hard, and never give the enemy a moment's peace, had broken the cycle of German recovery. Every mission, every sortie eroded the Luftwaffe further. By the end of May, entire bomber groups were flying to deep targets in Germany, with minimal opposition. The skies that had once been lethal to Allied bombers were now nearly clear of enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe had not surrendered, but it was finished. Its once deadly wings were shattered, its spirit crushed. Doolittle's decision to unleash his fighters offensively had achieved what years of defensive tactics could not: the destruction of the German Air Force as an effective fighting force. And as the summer of 1944 approached, this victory in the air would make possible the greatest invasion in history. By June 1944, the results of Doolittle's bold transformation were unmistakable. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, now existed only in fragments. German fighter strength had been shattered, its experienced pilots gone, its airfields wrecked and fuel reserves nearly empty. The Americans had not merely beaten the Luftwaffe, they had erased its presence from the western sky. When dawn broke over Normandy, on June 6, 1944, the difference could be seen and heard in every corner of northern France. Above the largest invasion fleet in history, the sky belonged entirely to the Allies. More than 14,000 Allied aircraft filled the air that day. Fighters, bombers, transports, and reconnaissance planes. The Luftwaffe managed to launch fewer than 300 sorties, most of them scattered and ineffective. The contrast was astonishing. Only 8 months earlier, American bomber crews had been slaughtered in daylight raids deep inside Germany. Now they flew with confidence, knowing that the enemy's air response was almost non-existent. This dominance was not achieved by accident or sheer numbers alone. It was the direct result of Doolittle's decision to fight offensively, to destroy German fighters before they could ever threaten Allied bombers or ground troops. His strategy had created a situation in which the Luftwaffe could no longer meaningfully interfere with Allied operations. For the German army on the ground, the effect was devastating. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of German forces in France, sent a message to his wife just 4 days after the invasion. "The enemy has complete control of the air. Our troops cannot move in daylight without being attacked. Our supplies cannot reach the front. Without air cover, we cannot hold the beaches." Allied fighter bombers roamed freely, strafing convoys, destroying tanks, and cutting off reinforcements. Every road, bridge, and rail line leading to Normandy became a death trap. German units that tried to move were annihilated from the air long before they could engage Allied ground forces. This overwhelming air supremacy made D-Day possible. The landings succeeded not only because of the soldiers who stormed the beaches, but also because the skies were clear of enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe's absence was the final proof that Doolittle's strategy had worked. Between January and June 1944, Germany had lost nearly 3/4 of its trained fighter pilots. By the time of the invasion, many German airfields had no fuel for training, no spare parts for repairs, and no veterans left to teach the young recruits. In contrast, the Allies continued to expand. More aircraft, more pilots, more missions every week. To the men flying over Normandy, the change was deeply personal. Many remembered the terrifying raids of 1943, when reaching the target was a miracle and survival was luck. Now, they looked down at the beaches below and saw the power of their hard-won air superiority. The skies were theirs, and because of that, the invasion below could succeed. The destruction of the Luftwaffe between January and June 1944 was one of the most rapid and complete collapses of any major fighting force in modern history. In just 6 months, Doolittle's aggressive doctrine had achieved what years of cautious defense could not. When Allied soldiers broke through the German lines in Normandy and began their march across France, they did so under skies protected by thousands of Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe that had once ruled Europe's airspace no longer existed as a meaningful force. The war in the air was effectively won, and it had been won not by defending, but by attack. The victory in the skies over Normandy was more than just a tactical success. It was the birth of a new philosophy of air warfare. What General Jimmy Doolittle had proven between January and June 1944 would forever reshape how air forces around the world thought, trained, and fought. Before Doolittle's arrival, the standard belief was that fighters existed to defend. They were guardians, staying close to protect bombers or ground forces from attack. It seemed logical, even noble, a way to reduce losses and preserve valuable crews. But Doolittle had demonstrated that this mindset was not only flawed, but dangerously limiting. Defense, no matter how brave, could never win control of the sky. The lesson was simple yet profound. Air superiority comes from offense, not defense. Under his direction, fighters stopped reacting to the enemy and began seizing the initiative. Instead of waiting for German fighters to attack bomber formations, American pilots went out to hunt them. Every engagement, every strafing run, every sweep over an airfield was part of a larger design to destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to fight at all. The results spoke for themselves. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent force. German aircraft production still continued, but factories could not replace the experience and skill that had been lost. 1,000 new planes meant nothing if there were no trained pilots left to fly them. This realization echoed across Allied command. General Karl Spaatz, head of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe, summarized it clearly. General Doolittle's decision to unleash the fighters was the decisive factor in winning air superiority. We destroyed more German aircraft in 4 months than in the previous 2 years. Even commanders, who had once opposed him, admitted they had been wrong. Major General Frederick Anderson, who had previously insisted that fighters remain close to bombers, later said, "Killing enemy fighters before they attack is far more effective than killing them during the attack." Doolittle understood this. I did not. The transformation went beyond one campaign. The success of 1944 redefined Air Force doctrine for generations. Future wars, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond, would adopt the same principle. The best defense for one's own forces is to destroy the enemy's capacity to fight. Air combat training began to focus not on escort formations, but on initiative, flexibility, and aggression. Pilots were taught that victory depended on striking first, maintaining altitude advantage, and never surrendering the offensive. Doolittle's directive had evolved from a single tactical order into a guiding principle of modern air power. For the men who lived through those months in 1944, the change was personal. Fighter pilots who had once circled nervously around bomber formations now roamed freely across the continent, turning the tables on an enemy that had dominated the skies for years. Bomber crews, who had feared abandonment, came to realize that the best way to be protected was for their escorts to hunt the hunters. And for Doolittle himself, this doctrinal revolution was his proudest achievement. In later interviews, he reflected, "You can't win by defending. You win by attacking. That's true in the air, on the ground, or anywhere." The offensive fighter doctrine that was born in the winter of 1944 would outlive the war that created it. It became a cornerstone of every major air campaign that followed. The lesson was written not just in manuals or training programs, but in the clear blue skies over Normandy. Skies that were free because one general had dared to think differently. Behind the triumph of Doolittle's new strategy lay a price that could not be measured in statistic alone. The victory in the skies came at a terrible cost, one paid by thousands of young men who fought and died in the cold, thin air above Europe between January and June 1944. While the Luftwaffe was being torn apart, the 8th Air Force suffered staggering casualties of its own. More than 7,000 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured during those months. Entire bomber crews vanished over enemy territory, their planes seen burning in the distance or breaking apart under enemy fire. Even as the Allies gained control of the air, the human toll never stopped. For the bomber crews, life remained a daily gamble. Missions deep into Germany still meant hours of exposure to flak, freezing temperatures, and the constant fear of fighters slipping through the protective screens. Each takeoff carried the unspoken question, who among them would not return? Fighter pilots faced their own kind of peril. Doolittle's order had given them freedom to hunt, but it also meant entering combat far from help, deep over enemy territory. When a pilot was shot down, rescue was almost impossible. Many who survived the fall were captured. Others were never found. The aggressive tactics that brought victory demanded immense courage from those who carried them out. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who survived to become one of America's top aces, later reflected on the cost. We talk about tactics and strategy and numbers, but what really happened was that thousands of young men climbed into their aircraft every day and flew into combat, knowing many would not return. We won because we had the courage to keep going. The same was true on the other side. For the German pilots, the air war became a slow march toward extinction. As veteran leaders fell, inexperienced recruits took their place. Boys barely out of flight school, facing opponents far better trained and equipped. They fought bravely, but few survived more than a handful of missions. Letters recovered after the war paint a tragic picture. Some young pilots wrote to their families about fear, exhaustion, and hopelessness. One German airman wrote shortly before his death, "We no longer believe we can win. We fly because it is our duty. But each day we return with fewer friends." By the summer of 1944, even the most dedicated Luftwaffe commanders understood that their fighter force had been sacrificed. The veterans who had once been the pride of Germany's air arm were gone, replaced by names that would never be remembered. War in the air had always been ruthless, but under Doolittle's strategy, it became total. His decision to attack everywhere, in the air, on the ground, during takeoff and landing, meant no moment of safety for the enemy. It was the only way to win, but it left a trail of wreckage that stretched from the skies over Berlin to the quiet fields of England. Yet, out of this destruction came survival for countless others. Each German fighter destroyed meant dozens of bomber crewmen who lived to see another day. The offensive tactics that seemed so ruthless were, in the end, the most effective form of protection. For those who fought, the victory was bittersweet. They had achieved the impossible, the complete destruction of the Luftwaffe, but many of their friends had paid for it with their lives. The airfields of England were filled with empty bunks, silent mess halls, and names crossed off flight rosters. When the survivors looked back, they understood what their sacrifices had meant. Because they had endured, the invasion of Europe succeeded, and the war moved one step closer to its end. But they also understood that air supremacy had been bought with blood, and that behind every strategic victory stood 1,000 personal losses. The skies were finally free, but freedom had never come cheaply. When the war finally ended, the skies over Europe told their own silent story, once filled with the black crosses of the Luftwaffe. They were now clear, owned entirely by the Allies. And at the center of that transformation stood one man, General James "Jimmy" Doolittle. To many of his peers in early 1944, Doolittle's decision to abandon traditional fighter escort tactics had seemed reckless. even dangerous. But history would judge it as one of the most brilliant strategic shifts of the entire war. A single, decisive change that turned defeat into dominance. In a matter of months, Doolittle had not invented new technology or discovered a secret weapon. What he did was far more difficult. He challenged a doctrine that everyone believed was untouchable. By ordering his fighters to hunt instead of guard, he redefined what it meant to control the air. The numbers told the story of his success. Between January and December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 4,000 fighter pilots over Germany. American and British forces destroyed over 11,000 German aircraft in the air and on the ground. The kill ratio, once in Germany's favor, now stood at nearly 4-1 for the Allies, and by 1945 it would reach 7-1. But beyond the statistics, Doolittle's victory was intellectual and moral. He proved that air warfare could not be won defensively, that technology and courage alone were not enough. It required initiative, aggression, and adaptability. He showed that sometimes the most humane strategy is also the most ruthless one. To strike first, end the threat quickly, and prevent years of endless losses. For the Luftwaffe, his doctrine spelled disaster. Germany continued to build planes well into 1945, even introducing advanced jet fighters like the Me-26-2. But by then, it no longer mattered. There were no trained pilots left to fly them, no fuel to keep them in the air, and no safe airfields to launch from. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. After the war, Doolittle was hailed as both a hero and a visionary. He received the Medal of Honor, multiple Distinguished Service Medals, and even an honorary knighthood from Britain. Yet when asked which of his achievements mattered most, the famous Doolittle raid over Tokyo or the air campaign in Europe, he always pointed to the winter of 1944, when he changed a single sign on a wall and rewrote the laws of air combat. In a later interview, Doolittle reflected on that moment. Changing the fighter tactics was the hardest decision I ever made. Many thought it was madness, but I knew from my own experience that you can't win by defending. You win by attacking. The losses were terrible, but they would have been worse if we had stayed passive. We won because we dared to fight differently. Today, the two signs from that office in England hang side by side in the National Museum of the United States Air Force. One reads, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." The other, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." Together they mark the moment when the air war and the war itself turned irreversibly in the Allies' favor. For the men who lived through it, Doolittle's order was not just a line of text, it was a lifeline. Bomber crews, who once cursed him for abandoning them, later realized that his madness had saved their lives. The fighter pilots who followed his lead became the most dominant airmen of the war, and the enemy pilots who once ruled the skies learned too late the price of underestimating him. By freeing his fighters to hunt, Doolittle had done what no bombing campaign or new aircraft design could achieve. He had destroyed the Luftwaffe in a matter of weeks and secured the skies for the liberation of Europe. His legacy endures in every air force that takes to the sky today. From the jet age to the modern era, the lesson remains unchanged. Air superiority is not won by defending. It is won by attacking, by striking first, and by never giving the enemy control of the air. Jimmy Doolittle understood that truth long before anyone else dared to believe it. And because of that, when Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy under clear blue skies, they did so in freedom bought by his courage, his vision, and his willingness to defy convention. The sign came down on January 6, 1944. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was finished, and with it, the road to victory in Europe was open.